Los Angeles is a city of blinding lights, but in the winter of 1977, the darkness staring back from the hills was paralyzing. Young women were vanishing from street corners, only to reappear days later, displayed on the grassy embankments like discarded mannequins for the morning commuters to find. The police were frantic, hunting a lone phantom in the night. They were dead wrong. The horror wasn't the work of one monster, but a deadly bloodline. Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi, two cousins who turned the City of Angels into their personal hunting ground. This is the case of the Hillside Stranglers. To understand how a nightmare takes root, you have to look past the neon lights of the Sunset Strip and the manicured lawns of Beverly Hills. You have to go to the gritty industrial fringes of Glendale. While the rest of Los Angeles was dancing to the final beats of the disco era, a very different kind of rhythm was being established at 703 East Colorado Street. This was the address of Angelo Buono's auto upholstery shop, a nondescript building that smelled of stale oil, cheap fabric, and impending violence. Angelo Buono was not the type of man you would find at a Hollywood party. At 43, he was a rough blue-collar figure who wore his arrogance like a second skin. He was a man of the old school, but in the worst possible way. He viewed women not as people, but as property, objects to be used, broken, and discarded. His life was a cycle of petty crimes and brutal dominance, but he lacked the imagination to escalate his depravity beyond the walls of his shop. He was a loaded gun sitting on a table, dangerous but static. He needed a finger to pull the trigger. That trigger arrived in January 1976 in the form of his younger cousin, Kenneth Bianchi. If Buono was the brute force, Bianchi was the chameleon. He had just arrived from Rochester, New York, leaving behind a trail of petty scams and a fractured identity. Unlike his cousin, Bianchi was charming, articulate, and desperate for approval. But beneath the boyish good looks was a pathological need for power. He had applied to police academies and been rejected, a failure that didn't stop him from obsessed fantasies of authority. He began collecting ride-along experiences, buying fake badges, and studying police procedure with a terrifying intensity. He wanted the power of the badge without the morality of the law. When Bianchi moved in with Buono, the chemistry was instantaneous and toxic. It was a classic case of folie à deux, a madness shared by two. Buono provided the sanctuary, the dark, soundproofed upholstery shop where screams could be swallowed by the noise of industrial machines. Bianchi provided the narrative. He fed Buono's ego, and in return, Buono offered him a masterclass in cruelty. They started small, dabbling in pimping and intimidation. They would cruise the streets of Los Angeles in Buono's beige sedan, spotting women and playing a twisted game of cat and mouse. To the outside world, they were just two cousins trying to make a buck in the city. But inside that shop, surrounded by rolls of vinyl and foam, they were building a world where they were gods. The contrast was sickening. Outside, the California sun was shining on a city of optimism. Inside, two men were nurturing a hatred so profound it would soon spill over into the streets. The tragedy of the Hillside Strangler case is that neither man might have become a serial killer on his own. Buono might have remained a violent thug. Bianchi might have remained a petty con man. But together, they unlocked something dormant in each other. They validated each other's darkest impulses. The upholstery shop wasn't just a place of business. It was a cocoon. And by the autumn of 1977, The metamorphosis was complete. The monsters were ready to emerge, and they had the perfect disguise: a fake badge and a friendly wave. Most predators hunt in the shadows, relying on speed or surprise to subdue their prey. But Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi discovered a weapon far more effective than a knife or a gun. They discovered that if you want to paralyze a victim without touching her, you don't need brute force. You only need a prop, a flash of gold metal, an authoritative voice, a command. We are conditioned from the moment we are old enough to walk to obey the badge. It is a reflex deeper than survival. It is social programming. When a police officer tells you to stop, you stop. When they tell you to get in the car, you get in. You don't scream. You don't run. You cooperate because you believe that cooperation is the path to safety. For the Hillside Stranglers, this social contract was the ultimate cheat code. It allowed them to abduct women in plain sight on busy streets, while the rest of the city watched and did absolutely nothing. The architect of this deception was Kenneth Bianchi. His failure to join the real police force hadn't diminished his obsession. It had mutated it. He spent hours studying police codes, buying handcuffs, and acquiring a realistic-looking badge. He understood that authority is a performance. If you look the part, and if you speak with the flat-board cadence of a detective working a late shift, people will hand you their lives. The first major test of this authority trap came with Judith Miller. It was Halloween, 1977. The city was full of people in costumes, but the most dangerous mask was the one worn by the two men cruising the Sunset Strip in a beige sedan. The car itself was part of the ruse, nondescript, domestic, the perfect undercover vehicle. When they spotted Judith, they didn't lunge. They simply pulled over. Bianchi flashed the badge. "Police, we need you to come with us." Imagine the confusion in Judith's mind. She hadn't committed a crime. But the human brain scrambles to find a reason for the intervention. Did I jaywalk? Is there an emergency? Am I a witness to something? The fear of the law is a specific kind of anxiety. It makes you small. It makes you compliant. She got into the back seat of the sedan, believing she was heading to a precinct to clear up a misunderstanding. She didn't know that the lock on the door wasn't there to keep criminals out. It was there to keep her in. As the car turned away from the bright lights of Hollywood and headed towards the dark industrial grid of Glendale, the silence in the car must have become deafening. The officers stopped talking procedure. The air grew heavy with a menace that no badge could conceal. By the time they reached the upholstery shop, the illusion of the law had evaporated, replaced by the terrifying reality of two predators who had tricked her into walking into her own grave. But if Judith Miller was the rehearsal, the abduction of Lauren Wagner was the devastating proof of concept. This is the moment where the fake cop narrative moves from scary to absolutely heartbreaking. Lauren was 18 years old. She was a business student, living with her parents in the San Fernando Valley. She was the good girl, responsible, cautious, the kind of person who checked her mirrors and locked her doors. On the night of November 28th, she was parked on a quiet residential street. She was safe. She was feet away from homes filled with families. Then the beige sedan pulled up. This wasn't a dark alley abduction. This happened under the streetlights. Neighbors were home. People were watching television, eating dinner, living their lives just yards away. Witnesses actually looked out their windows and saw the interaction. They saw two men approach Lauren's car. They saw a brief conversation. They saw Lauren get out of her own vehicle and walked to the sedan. Why didn't anyone call 911? Why didn't anyone scream? Because it looked like a routine police stop. The witnesses saw the authority in Bianchi's stance. They saw the compliance in Lauren's movements. To the untrained eye, it was just the law doing its job. The tragedy of Lauren Wagner is that she was punished for doing exactly what society tells women to do. Trust the authorities. She didn't fight because she thought she was being arrested. She thought she was going to a station where she could call her father. She thought the system was working. We can only imagine the horror of the drive that followed. As the sedan merged onto the freeway, heading back to the slaughterhouse in Glendale, the dynamic inside the car would have shifted. The good cop veneer would have cracked. Perhaps Bianchi made a comment that was too personal, too lewd for an officer. Perhaps Buono, the silent muscle behind the wheel, let out a laugh that chilled her blood. The geography of Los Angeles became a prison. Every exit they passed was a lost opportunity. The realization that these men were not police officers would not have hit all at once. It would have been a slow, creeping dawn of absolute terror. The handcuffs on her wrists, which minutes ago represented a legal formality, were now the bonds of a hostage. The safety of the police car was actually a cage on wheels. When they finally arrived at 703 East Colorado Street, the deception was over. The upholstery shop was a fortress of solitude in the middle of the city. Heavy industrial doors, soundproofed walls designed to dampen the noise of machinery, or the screams of a dying girl. As the garage door rolled down behind the sedan, sealing them in darkness, the last shred of civilization vanished. Lauren Wagner was smart. She was brave. But she never stood a chance against the psychological warfare of the Hillside Stranglers. They had hacked the human mind. They had used the very symbol of protection, the police badge, to disarm their victim. The betrayal is almost biblical. The shepherd wasn't just a wolf in disguise. The shepherd was the butcher. By the time the city realized what was happening, the damage was done. The fear that gripped Los Angeles wasn't just the fear of a killer. It was the fear of the unknown. Women stopped pulling over for flashing lights. The LAPD had to go on television and tell citizens that they had the right to drive to a lit area before stopping, an admission that the streets belonged to the predators. Buono and Bianchi had done more than kill. They had destroyed the trust that holds a city together. They proved that in the city of angels, the devil doesn't need horns. He just needs a badge and a convincing lie. If the deception on the street was a performance of authority, what happened behind the closed doors of Angelo Buono's upholstery shop was a performance of absolute, unadulterated sadism. When the heavy industrial door rolled down at 703 East Colorado Street, the mask of the police officer was discarded, and the true face of the Hillside Stranglers was revealed. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a laboratory. And the subject of their most grotesque experiment was a 20-year-old art student named Christina Weckler. To understand the fate of Christina Weckler is to confront the darkest depths of the human capacity for cruelty. She wasn't just murdered, she was studied. Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi had grown bored with the simplicity of strangulation. Their madness demanded escalation. They began to view their victims not merely as objects of dominance, but as biological puzzles to be solved. They wanted to know how long it took for a light to go out. They wanted to know if they could kill without leaving a mark. Christina Weckler was abducted on November 20th, 1977. She was a quiet, sensitive soul, a young woman who saw beauty in the world. When she was brought into the suffocating atmosphere of the shop, a space cluttered with rolls of vinyl, smelling of stale dust and industrial adhesive, she was walking into a trap designed to test the limits of human endurance. The forensic narrative of what happened next is a chilling testament to the killer's detachment. Bianchi, ever the failed intellectual, had been reading about execution methods. He was fascinated by the mechanics of death. He proposed an idea to Buono that was as impractical as it was horrific. They would create their own gas chamber. They dragged a chair into the bathroom of the shop. They bound Christina to it. Then they rigged a crude, terrifying apparatus using a hose connected to the gas stove in the kitchen. They sealed the vents. They turned on the gas. This creates a scene of visceral horror. Imagine the sound of the gas hissing through the tube. Imagine the smell, the artificial rotten egg odor of mercaptan filling the small tiled room. They weren't killing her in a fit of rage. They were waiting. They stood on the other side of the door, checking their watches, listening for the sound of breathing to stop. It was a cold, clinical observation of suffering. But the experiment failed. The gas leaked. The concentration wasn't high enough to kill quickly. Instead of a swift end, Christina was left in a state of prolonged, terrified consciousness, struggling for air in a room that was slowly poisoning her. This failure didn't evoke pity in Buono and Bianchi. It evoked frustration. They were annoyed that their science was flawed. So, they moved to Plan B. And this is where the banality of their evil becomes truly nauseating. They didn't reach for a weapon of war. They reached for a household cleaning product. Bianchi, in his warped studies of medicine and chemistry, had theorized that injecting an air bubble into the veins would cause a fatal embolism, a heart attack that would look natural on an autopsy table. But they decided to add a sadistic twist. They filled a hypodermic needle not just with air, but with cleaning fluid. Specifically, a blue liquid found under almost every kitchen sink in America, Windex. It is difficult to process the level of detachment required to do this. To look at a terrified young woman, and then look at a bottle of glass cleaner, and decide to combine the two. They injected the fluid into her arm. They watched. They waited. Again, the result was not death, but agony. The chemicals burned her veins, causing immense physical pain. But they didn't stop her heart. The killers were incompetent butchers playing at being surgeons. Their repeated failures meant that Christina Weckler's final hours were a drawn-out, agonizing ordeal of trial and error. Every time a method failed, they tried another, compounding her terror. Finally, stripped of their pretensions of being scientific killers, they reverted to their base nature. Buono, the brute, grew tired of the games. They ended her life with a plastic bag and a piece of ligature. The experiment was over, but the stain on humanity it left behind was permanent. This location, this house of horrors, also witnessed the final defiance of Lauren Wagner. If Christina Weckler represented the killer's desire to experiment, Lauren Wagner represented the victim's refusal to break. We must return to Lauren for a moment, because her time inside the shop provides a crucial psychological counterpoint to the killer's arrogance. After the fake cop, ruse, fell apart, after the realization hit that she was in the hands of monsters, Lauren Wagner didn't just cower. Even as she faced the inevitability of death, she retained a spark of fury. According to later testimony and the reconstruction of events, Lauren looked her captors in the eye. She saw them for what they were: pathetic, small men hiding behind violence. She delivered a line that should have haunted them for the rest of their lives. She said, "You won't get away with this." It wasn't a plea. It was a promise. In that moment, inside a soundproofed dungeon where no one could hear her, Lauren Wagner was the only person in the room who saw the future clearly. Buono and Bianchi laughed at her. They believed they were invincible. They believed they were smarter than the police, smarter than the public, and certainly smarter than their victims. They thought the upholstery shop was a fortress that would keep their secrets forever. But Lauren was right. Her words were a prophecy. The juxtaposition of these two events, the clinical, bungled torture of Christina Weckler and the fierce defiance of Lauren Wagner, paints a complete picture of the darkness that resided at 703 East Colorado Street. It wasn't just a place where women died. It was a place where the value of human life was reduced to zero. The forensic evidence found later would tell a story of chaotic brutality. Lint from the upholstery fabric was found on the bodies, a microscopic thread that would eventually help tie the crimes to the location. The marks on the victims showed the use of ligatures, tape, and handcuffs consistent with the tools found in the shop. But physical evidence can't capture the atmosphere of those nights. It captures the silence of the aftermath. After the screaming stopped, after the gas was turned off, Buono and Bianchi would clean up. They would wash the tools. They would put the Windex back under the sink. They would go back to their daily lives, Buono repairing car seats, Bianchi dreaming of being a cop. They normalized the abnormal. To them, the screams were just part of the nightly routine, a noise to be dampened by the soundproofing they had so carefully installed. But soundproofing only works for so long. You can silence a voice, but you cannot silence the truth. The agony inflicted on Christina Weckler, the gas, the needles, the terror, was building a karmic debt that would eventually bankrupt the killers. And Lauren Wagner's final vow, whispered in the dark, was already traveling out into the universe, setting the gears of justice in motion, even if it would take months for the machine to catch up. The upholstery shop was designed to keep the world out, but it couldn't keep the ghosts in. And soon, the sheer weight of what happened within those walls would bring the entire structure crashing down. In the geography of a serial killer's mind, victims are rarely people. They are objects, opportunities, or risks. Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi operated with a cold, predatory calculus. They chose women who they believed could be snatched, broken, and discarded without bringing the full wrath of the Hollywood establishment down upon them. But in the chaotic sprawl of Los Angeles, where fame and anonymity bleed into one another, even the most calculated predators can make a mistake. And one night, fate played a card that saved a life in the most bizarre way imaginable. It happened during the height of their spree. The city was already on edge. The cousins were cruising, hunting for the next subject to bring back to the upholstery shop. They spotted a young woman, 25 years old, alone. She fit their profile perfectly: vulnerable, attractive, and isolated. They initiated the routine that had worked so flawlessly on Lauren Wagner and Judith Miller. The beige sedan slowed down. The window rolled down. The badge was flashed. The woman was Catherine Lore. Like so many in Los Angeles, she was an aspiring actress, the daughter of a Hollywood legend. But Buono and Bianchi didn't know that. To them, she was just another body to be added to the count. They ordered her into the car. They played the role of the undercover vice squad, perhaps questioning her about why she was out so late, or pretending to investigate a robbery in the area. Catherine, unsuspecting and trusting of the badge, complied. She was sitting in the back seat of the car, the same seat where others had realized too late that they were going to die. But this time, the script changed. As part of their police procedure, the killers asked for her identification. She handed over her driver's license. Kenneth Bianchi looked at the name. Lore. He paused. In a city obsessed with celebrity, the name carried weight. He asked her a question that would determine her fate. Are you related to Peter Lorre? Peter Lorre was a titan of cinema, famous for playing creeping, wide-eyed villains and, ironically, a child murderer in the classic film A.M. Catherine looked at the officer and confirmed it. Yes, she said. He was my father. The air in the car shifted instantly. This wasn't a moral hesitation. Buono and Bianchi didn't suddenly grow a conscience because they were fans of classic film. It was a tactical retreat. In their twisted logic, killing a random student or a drifter was safe crime. But killing the daughter of a Hollywood icon? That would bring a level of heat they weren't ready for. A celebrity's child doesn't just disappear. The FBI gets involved. The media storm would be unmanageable. They looked at each other. The predatory hunger was overruled by the instinct for self-preservation. They handed her license back. They didn't drive her to the upholstery shop. They didn't pull out the handcuffs. They simply let her go. They likely told her to be careful, to go straight home, maintaining the good cop persona to the very end. Catherine Lorre stepped out of the car and walked away, completely unaware that she had just survived the Hillside Stranglers. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She went home thinking she had just had a brush with two slightly intense police officers. She didn't even report the incident, because in her mind, no crime had occurred. The horror of this encounter only revealed itself years later. After Buono and Bianchi were arrested, and their faces were plastered across every newspaper in America, Catherine Lorre saw the photos. She recognized the eyes. She recognized the smirk. The realization must have been a physical blow. The knowledge that she had been sitting in a cage with two monsters, and the only thing that unlocked the door was the ghost of her father. This incident, known as the Lorre paradox, serves as a chilling reminder of the randomness of death. There was no struggle, no escape plan, no heroism. She survived simply because of who her father was. It underscores the terrifying reality that for Buono and Bianchi, murder was a business decision. They weighed the cost of her life against the risk of their capture, and for once, the math worked in the victim's favor. But as Catherine walked into the safety of the night, the cousins simply started the car engine again. They were still hungry, and the next woman they found would not have a famous last name to save her. Luck is a finite resource. For months, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono had been operating on a surplus of it in Los Angeles, dodging dragnets and escaping near misses through sheer audacity. But by early 1978, the heat in the kitchen had become unbearable, even for them. The paranoia that had bonded the cousins began to tear them apart. Bianchi, sensing the walls closing in, and perhaps believing his own delusion that he could be a big man on his own, decided to flee. He left the smog of L.A. for the rain-soaked quiet of Bellingham, Washington. He thought he was escaping his crimes. In reality, he was running directly into the trap that would end him. Bellingham was the antithesis of Los Angeles. It was a small, trusting university town nestled in the Pacific Northwest, a place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors knew each other by name. Bianchi arrived with a plan to go straight. He landed a job that appealed to his obsession with authority, a security guard. He was given a uniform, a truck, and the keys to various properties. For a moment, it seemed the chameleon had successfully changed his colors. But a predator cannot change its nature. It can only change its hunting ground. The urge to kill didn't vanish with the change in zip code. It festered. Without Buono's brute force to ground him, Bianchi became reckless. He was no longer part of a disciplined unit. He was a loose cannon. On January 11th, 1979, the discipline finally snapped. Bianchi set his sights on two young students from Western Washington University, Karen Mandick and Diane Wilder. Karen was 22, Diane was 27. They were house-sitting a residence that Bianchi was assigned to patrol. It was the perfect setup, or so he thought. He used a ruse that was a sloppy echo of the Los Angeles playbook. He told Karen he needed her to come to a different house he was guarding to help him with a security issue. It was the same authority trap, but without the badge and without the careful planning. He lured them to a secluded house in a cul-de-sac. But this time, the execution was chaotic. Trying to control two women alone is infinitely harder than doing it with a partner. The violence that ensued was messy and desperate. He strangled them, reliving the horror of the upholstery shop, but he lacked the facilities to dispose of the evidence properly. He didn't have the hillsides of L.A. He had a suburban neighborhood. Panic set in. Bianchi drove the victim's car into the woods, leaving the bodies inside the trunk. But here is where the Bellingham mistake began to unfold, a cascade of errors so amateurish it shattered the myth of the criminal genius he had built for himself. First, the car. In Los Angeles, the cousins used anonymous sedans and dumped bodies in desolate areas. In Bellingham, Bianchi left the victim's car in a cul-de-sac, partially hidden but easily discoverable. Second, the witnesses. Bianchi had been seen interacting with the women. He wasn't a phantom anymore. He was Ken the security guard. When Karen and Diane failed to return, their friends didn't just worry. They acted. They told the police immediately that the girls had gone to meet a security guard. The Bellingham police were not the LAPD. They weren't overwhelmed by hundreds of homicides a year. They were focused, and they moved with terrifying speed. Within hours of the bodies being found, detectives were knocking on Kenneth Bianchi's door. This is where the procedural noose began to tighten. When questioned, Bianchi played the roles of the innocent, confused newcomer. He claimed he didn't know the girls well. He claimed he had been elsewhere. But he made a slip that would have been fatal in any jurisdiction: his California driver's license. When the Bellingham detectives ran his ID, the teletype machine spit out a piece of information that stopped them cold. Kenneth Bianchi wasn't just a security guard from Rochester. He had just arrived from Los Angeles, the very city currently paralyzed by the Hillside Strangler murders. It was a thin thread, a coincidence, but good police work is built on pulling at thin threads until the whole sweater unravels. The detectives impounded his truck. They secured the crime scene. And then, forensic science, the very thing Bianchi obsessed over, turned against him. In the house where the murders took place, the carpet was a distinctive deep green shag. It was the 70s. These materials were everywhere. But forensic analysis operates on the principle of exchange. Every contact leaves a trace. When Bianchi killed Karen and Diane, he dragged their bodies across that carpet. Microscopic fibers from the green carpet were found clinging to the victim's clothing. Microscopic fibers from the victim's clothing were found in Bianchi's truck, and crucial fibers from Bianchi's own uniform were found on the bodies. It was a forensic trinity, a mathematical proof of guilt. There was no way to explain it away. He hadn't just been near them. He had been in contact with them in the very house he denied entering. But the final nail in the coffin was the California connection. The Bellingham police reached out to the LAPD. They compared notes. They looked at the MO, the strangulation, the positioning, the sexual assault. The puzzle pieces from two different states slammed together with a deafening click. The Hillside Strangler wasn't a ghost. He was a security guard sitting in a holding cell in Washington State. The arrest of Kenneth Bianchi was the turning point. The arrogance that had allowed him to kill with impunity in Los Angeles became his downfall in Bellingham. He thought he was smarter than the small-town cops. He thought he could outrun his past. But he forgot the golden rule of the fugitive. You can run from a crime scene, but you cannot run from the evidence you carry with you. The Bellingham mistake wasn't just a sloppy murder. It was the key that unlocked the entire mystery. It exposed Bianchi not as a mastermind, but as a narcissist who got lucky until he got lazy. And as the handcuffs clicked shut in that rainy Washington precinct, the dominoes began to fall all the way back to the upholstery shop in Glendale. The game was up. The Phantom had a face, and soon he would have a voice that would sing like a canary and drag his cousin Angelo down into the darkness with him. The hunt was over. The reckoning had begun. The handcuffs were on, but Kenneth Bianchi wasn't finished playing games. In fact, inside the interrogation room, he was just setting up the board for his greatest performance yet. The evidence against him in Bellingham was damning. The fibers, the ID, the witnesses. And looming over him was the specter of the death penalty in California for the Hillside Strangler murders. Bianchi knew he couldn't beat the evidence with facts. He couldn't argue his way out of the DNA or the eyewitness accounts. So, he decided to escape the only way a narcissist knows how. He would retreat into a fantasy. He wouldn't plead innocent. He would plead insane. But not just insane in the legal sense. Bianchi, ever the student of psychology textbooks, decided to construct a defense so elaborate, so cinematic, that it would baffle the experts and turn him into a medical curiosity rather than a monster. He claimed that Kenneth Bianchi was a gentle, misunderstood security guard who wouldn't hurt a fly. The killings, those were the work of Steve. Steve was the darkness. Steve was the alter ego who took control of Ken's body, committed unspeakable acts, and then vanished, leaving Ken with no memory of the bloodshed. It was a classic case of multiple personality disorder, or at least, that's what Bianchi wanted the world to believe. He studied the symptoms. He practiced the switches. He prepared to act for his life. Enter Dr. Martin Orne. Dr. Orne was not a small-town therapist. He was a titan in the field of forensic psychiatry, a man who had spent a lifetime studying the human mind's capacity for deception. When the defense team brought him in to examine Bianchi, they expected him to validate the diagnosis. Bianchi certainly expected it. He looked at the doctor and saw just another audience member for his one-man show. He didn't realize he was staring at the man who would destroy him. The confrontation that followed is one of the most intense psychological duels in criminal history. It took place in a stark, sterile examination room. On one side, the killer sweating, eager, his eyes darting with calculated madness. On the other, the doctor, calm, bespectacled, his voice a low, soothing drone. Orn began the hypnosis session. To the untrained eye, it looked like Bianchi was going under. His head lolled back. His breathing slowed. When Orn asked to speak to Steve, Bianchi's entire demeanor shifted. This was the performance he had rehearsed. He snarled. His voice dropped an octave. He became aggressive, rude, and boastful. Steve admitted to the killings with a vile pride, laughing at the weakness of Ken. He gave details only the killer would know, all while Ken was supposedly asleep. It was convincing. It was terrifying. Most observers in the room were chilled to the bone. They believed they were witnessing a fracturing of the soul. But Dr. Martin Orn wasn't watching the show. He was watching the actor. Orn noticed things that didn't fit. He noticed that Steve would only appear when the suggestion was made. He noticed that Bianchi's trance seemed a little too convenient. A true multiple personality disorder is messy, chaotic, and often subtle. Bianchi's version was like a bad B-movie villain, too consistent, too stereotypical. So, Dr. Orn decided to plant a trap so subtle, so brilliant, that only a liar would fall into it. During a moment of hypnosis, while speaking to the supposed Steve, Orn leaned in close. He spoke with the authority of an expert, sharing a secret. He said effectively, "You know, it's fascinating. In almost every genuine case of multiple personality disorder I've ever studied, there aren't just two personalities. That's very rare. There are almost always three. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. There is no rule in psychiatry that says there must be three personalities." Orn made it up on the spot to see what Bianchi would do. The room went silent. The tape recorder whirred on the table, capturing the sound of Kenneth Bianchi's brain processing this new information. You can almost see the gears turning in his head. 3? The doctor says there should be 3. If I only have 2, maybe he won't believe me. If I want to prove I'm crazy, I need to give him what he expects. Bianchi paused. He twitched. And then, right there in the chair, a miracle of medicine occurred. I'm Billy, a new voice squeaked. Billy had arrived. The third personality. It was the moment the mask fell off. By producing a third personality on command, simply because the doctor suggested it should exist, Bianchi proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was faking. A real patient doesn't invent new people to satisfy a doctor's theory. A bad actor does. Orn maintained his composure, but internally, the checkmate was delivered. He continued the session, allowing Billy to talk, allowing Bianchi to dig the hole deeper and deeper. Billy was a childish, frightened persona, clearly improvised on the fly. It was pathetic. It was desperate. When the session ended and Bianchi woke up, he likely thought he had aced the test. He probably thought Dr. Orn was writing up the diagnosis that would send him to a secure hospital instead of San Quentin. But when the report came back, it was a devastation. Dr. Orn declared that Kenneth Bianchi was not insane. He was not a multiple. He was a psychopath with a high IQ who was simulating mental illness to escape justice. The Steve and Billy charade wasn't just a failure. It was the final nail in his coffin. The prosecution now had proof of his deceptiveness. They had proof that he was rational enough to construct a complex lie. The insanity defense evaporated instantly. The psychological impact of this defeat on Bianchi was catastrophic. His narcissism couldn't handle the humiliation. He had tried to outsmart the best, and he had been played like a fiddle. With his get-out-of-jail-free card burned, Bianchi panicked. He looked at his situation. He was facing the death penalty in 2 states. He was alone. The Steve persona couldn't save him. Billy couldn't save him. So, Kenneth Bianchi did the only thing a coward has left to do. He turned on his partner. If he couldn't be the insane victim, he would be the star witness. He reached out to the prosecutors with a deal. He would give them everything. He would give them the dates, the times, the methods, and most importantly, he would give them Angelo Buono. The shift in the interrogation room was palpable. Gone were the fake voices. Gone was the theatrical drooling and the staged amnesia. In their place sat the real Kenneth Bianchi, cold, articulate, and vindictive. He began to spill the secrets of the upholstery shop. He described the torture of Christina Weckler. He described the fake cop routine. He described the laughter of his cousin Angelo. He painted Angelo as the mastermind, the brute who forced him into it, trying to minimize his own role even as he confessed. But the investigators didn't care about his spin. They cared about the information. Bianchi provided details that only the killers could know. He drew maps. He identified locations. The mind games were over. Dr. Martin Orne had won. He had used a simple sentence to dismantle a psychopath's defense. But in winning the battle against Bianchi, the justice system had unlocked a new horror. Bianchi's testimony was the key to catching Angelo Buono. But it came at a price. The state would have to make a deal with the devil to catch the demon. Bianchi would avoid the death penalty in exchange for his testimony. As the detectives listened to Bianchi narrate the atrocities with a chilling calmness, they realized that Steve and Billy were never real. The monster wasn't a separate entity living inside Kenneth Bianchi. The monster was Kenneth Bianchi. And now, that monster was going to point his finger at the only person in the world he had ever trusted, setting the stage for one of the longest and most contentious trials in American history. The partnership was dead. The betrayal was absolute. And Angelo Buono, sitting in his cell, had no idea that his cousin, the boy he had schooled in violence, was about to become his executioner. But the nightmare, it seemed, was not content to remain behind bars. While the police and prosecutors were building their fortress of evidence against Angelo Buono, believing they had finally cornered the beasts of Los Angeles, a new and bizarre chapter was being written in the shadows. It was a plot so audacious, so scientifically twisted, that it would test the very limits of belief. Just as the forensic advancements of Edwardian London had once changed the game for detectives, a perverse manipulation of forensic science was about to be deployed to subvert justice entirely. Kenneth Bianchi, now incarcerated and seemingly neutralized, was far from idle. He had traded the streets of Los Angeles for a jail cell, but his capacity for manipulation remained as potent as ever. He had found a new audience, not in a terrified victim, but in a woman named Veronica Compton. She was an aspiring playwright, a woman drawn to the darkness, who had initially contacted Bianchi under the guise of researching a script about a serial killer. But much like the unsavory characters that once flocked to the darkened pubs of Camden Town, Compton found herself pulled into a gravitational orbit She couldn't escape. The dynamic between them shifted rapidly. Bianchi, ever the chameleon, shed the skin of the confessed killer and donned the mask of the misunderstood victim. He spun a tale of coercion and innocence, a narrative that appealed to Compton's artistic sensibilities and her growing infatuation. She wasn't just observing a killer anymore. She was becoming an active participant in his defense, a pawn in a game of 4D chess that Bianchi was playing against the state of Washington and the terrified populace of California. The plan they hatched was a masterclass in desperation and forensic deceit. It hinged on a singular chilling premise. If the Hillside Stranglers struck again while Kenneth Bianchi was locked away in a high-security facility, then surely, logically, Bianchi could not be the strangler. To the public and the jury, it would cast a shadow of doubt so long it could shatter the prosecution's entire case. But to execute this, they needed more than just a copycat. They needed biological proof. They needed the killer's calling card. In a move that harked back to the most macabre fiction, Bianchi provided the raw materials for his own exoneration. During a visit in the prison library, amidst the hushed tones and rows of books, a transfer took place that was as ingenious as it was repulsive. Bianchi had managed to preserve a sample of his own semen. With a sleight of hand that would have impressed the street magicians of old London, this genetic evidence was sealed inside the finger of a rubber glove and hidden within the spine of a book. A text appropriately titled The Joy of Sex. Compton walked out of that prison not just with a book, but with a mission. She was no longer a writer. She was a proxy killer. The instructions were precise, dictating a crime that would mimic the gruesome signatures of the Hillside slayings to the letter. She was to find a victim, strangle her, and then, in a final act of staging, plant Bianchi's DNA at the scene. It was an attempt to weaponize the very forensic science that police relied upon, turning the silent witness of DNA into a liar. She traveled to Bellingham, Washington, a quiet backdrop for such a violent intent. There she targeted a woman named Kim Breed. The setup was eerily reminiscent of the deception Bianchi and Buono had used so many times before. A ruse to gain trust, a moment of vulnerability exploited. Compton lured Breed to a motel room, the classic setting for a transient crime. But unlike the practiced, brutal efficiency of Buono and Bianchi, Compton was an amateur attempting to perform a professional's dark work. When she made her move, attempting to strangle Breed with a cord, chaos ensued. The victim fought back with a ferocity Compton hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the silent, overpowering control Bianchi had described. It was a desperate, messy struggle for life. The sheer physicality of murder, the grit and the noise of it, overwhelmed the script. Breed managed to break free, screaming, escaping the room and the fate that had been written for her. Compton fled, the plan in ruins. The police were alerted, but the true depth of the conspiracy wasn't immediately apparent. It was only when authorities caught up with her that the full grotesque reality came to light. The discovery of the preserved semen, the realization of what she had intended to do with it, sent shockwaves through the investigation. It was a revelation that shocked the detectives to the core, much like the citizens of London a century prior. This wasn't just a girlfriend trying to help an inmate escape. This was a collaborative assault on the truth, orchestrated from inside a prison cell. The failure of the Semen Plot did not liberate Bianchi. Instead, it tightened the noose. It stripped away any remaining veneer of his coerced accomplice persona. It demonstrated a level of premeditation and ongoing malice that terrified those watching the case unfold. It proved that Kenneth Bianchi was not a man who had left his crimes in the past. He was an active predator, capable of extending his reach beyond concrete walls and steel doors. He was willing to commission the rape and murder of an innocent woman just to create a cloud of reasonable doubt. This incident served as a stark reminder to the court and the public. The fear of death that had permeated Los Angeles was not just a memory. It was a living, breathing thing, fueled by a man who treated murder like a theatrical production. The technology and systems designed to track culprits down, the modern equivalents of the Bertillon system and fingerprinting, were being tested not just by the crime itself, but by the criminal's attempt to hack the system. Veronica Compton found herself answering for her loyalty with a prison sentence of her own, her life as a playwright forever overshadowed by her role in this grim reality play. And for the prosecution against Angelo Buono, this was a critical turning point. It highlighted the absolute necessity of keeping these men permanently separated from society. If Bianchi could orchestrate this from a jail cell, what would happen if he were ever released? The Semen Plot was meant to be his ticket to freedom, his final act of genius. Instead, it became the definitive proof of his uncurable pathology, a final act of madness that sealed his reputation as one of the most manipulative monsters of the modern age. The failure of the Semen Plot did more than just expose Kenneth Bianchi's ongoing treachery. It hardened the resolve of the justice system to ensure that the gates of San Quentin would never open for Angelo Buono. The stage was finally set for the endgame, but justice, in the case of the Hillside Stranglers, would not be swift. It would be a grinding, exhausting war of attrition that would go down in history as one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials the United States had ever seen. For 2 agonizing years, the Los Angeles Superior Court became a theater of the macabre. The trial of Angelo Buono was less of a legal proceeding and more of a slow-motion dissection of evil. Day after day, week after week, the jury was forced to inhabit the dark, claustrophobic world of the upholstery shop. They weren't just listening to testimony. They were being submerged in the details of torture and death. The dynamic inside the courtroom was a study in contrasts. On the witness stand sat Kenneth Bianchi, the prosecution's star witness, yet also their greatest liability. He was erratic, combative, and prone to changing his story. He played to the cameras, trying to manipulate the narrative even as he implicated his cousin. He was the chaos element, a man whose word was worth nothing without corroboration. Sitting at the defense table was Angelo Buono. Throughout the entire 2-year ordeal, the Italian stallion remained a statue of stone. He rarely spoke. He showed no emotion. He simply glared. His silence was not the silence of the innocent. It was the silence of a predator waiting out a storm. He believed that without Bianchi's credibility, the state had nothing. He believed that the lack of fingerprints would be his salvation. But Buono had underestimated the silent witnesses. While Bianchi's testimony was the narrative framework, the true hero of the trial was the forensic science that had evolved since the days of Edwardian London. The prosecution, led by a team who understood that the jury needed more than the word of a psychopath, unleashed a torrent of microscopic evidence. They focused on the fibers, specifically the beige and orange shag carpet fibers found in Buono's home. In a moment of forensic brilliance, Experts demonstrated that these microscopic threads were found on the eyelids of Lauren Wagner. Think about the precision of that. A tiny, invisible piece of synthetic material transferred during a struggle or a moment of disposal had traveled from the floor of a killer's living room to the body of a victim found miles away. It was a link that no amount of lying could break. They found fibers from the upholstery shop on the girl's clothing. They found paint chips. They matched the specific chemical composition of the dust found in Buono's workshop to debris found on the victims. It was the Bertillon system of the atomic age. The prosecution built a cage not out of iron bars, but out of molecules. They argued that it was mathematically impossible for Angelo Buono to be innocent. Coincidence does not work 9 times in a row. The closing arguments were a plea for sanity in a case defined by madness. The jury was asked to look past the circus of Bianchi's behavior and look at the cold, hard science. They deliberated for weeks. The tension in Los Angeles was palpable. This was the city's chance to finally close the book on a fear that had gripped them for years. In November 1983, the foreman stood up. The verdict was read. Guilty. Angelo Buono was convicted of 9 counts of murder. The stone man finally cracked, if only for a moment. But the sentencing phase brought a final bitter twist to the saga. The prosecution had sought the death penalty, arguing that the depravity of the crimes demanded the ultimate punishment. However, the jury, perhaps tainted by the unreliability of Kenneth Bianchi, or perhaps weary from the sheer length of the proceedings, could not reach a unanimous decision on execution. Instead, Angelo Buono was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It felt to some like a partial victory. The monster would live. He would breathe the air, eat his meals, and sleep in a bed. Luxuries he had denied to Christina Weckler, to Lauren Wagner, to Judith Miller. But as the bailiffs led him away, shackled and defeated, the reign of the Hillside Stranglers was officially extinguished. The trial proved that while a killer might be able to wash away blood, and he might be able to hide a body, he cannot scrub away the microscopic trace of his own existence. The science of justice had caught up with the brutality of the crime. As the heavy doors of the prison slammed shut behind Angelo Buono, the hills of Los Angeles stood silent once more. The physical scars on the landscape, the embankments where the bodies were found, would eventually be covered by new grass and wildflowers. The seasons would change. The city would continue to grow, to build, to dream. But the psychological scars left by the cousins would prove far more permanent. The case of the Hillside Stranglers did something to the collective psyche of the city that could never be undone. Before Buono and Bianchi, there was a certain innocence to the American West. The police badge was a shield. A neighbor was a friend. A mechanic was just a man fixing your car. But after the revelations of the fake cop tactic, that trust was shattered. We learned that evil doesn't always look like a monster. It doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes evil wears a uniform. Sometimes it smiles at you from the front seat of a beige sedan. Sometimes it lives in a nondescript upholstery shop on a busy street, working 9 to 5 while hiding a dungeon behind the garage door. Angelo Buono died in prison in 2002 of a heart attack, alone in his cell. A pathetic end for a man who thought he was a god. Kenneth Bianchi remains incarcerated to this day, a graying old man whose chameleon days are long over. They are ghosts now, fading into the archives of true crime history. But their legacy serves as a grim reminder of the fragility of safety. They taught us that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we think. They forced us to look at the hills above Los Angeles not just as a beautiful backdrop, but as a silent witness to the darkness that can reside in the human heart. The story of the Hillside Stranglers is not just a story about death. It is a story about the loss of illusion. The illusion that authority is always good. The illusion that we are safe in the light. And perhaps that is why this case continues to haunt us. It whispers to us that the most dangerous predators are the ones who look exactly like us. Thank you for joining me on this investigation into this case file. If this deep dive captivated you, please hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you know. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and I'll see you in the next one.